In the vastness of space, the Galactic Council had long sought ways to foster understanding among the countless species that populated the stars. The latest initiative, a cultural exchange program, was hailed as a significant step forward. The program promised to bridge gaps between civilizations, and the diverse beings involved were eager to learn from one another. Among them was Zixia, a young female from the planet Xylaria. Her species was known for its strict, seasonal mating rituals, a fact that fascinated and puzzled many. Zixia was selected for the program due to her curiosity and willingness to embrace new experiences. She had always questioned the rigid customs of her people, wondering if other species might offer different perspectives on relationships and mating. Her bright green skin, delicate antennae, and expressive, multifaceted eyes made her stand out among the other participants. But it was her keen intelligence and open-mindedness that truly set her apart. Zixia had always been a thinker, someone who preferred to observe and analyze before jumping to conclusions. Her superiors believed she would represent Xylaria well, and Zixia was determined not to disappoint. When Zixia arrived on Earth, she was immediately struck by the planet's vibrant, chaotic beauty. The diversity of life, both flora and fauna, was unlike anything she had ever seen. The humans themselves were a source of endless fascination. They were a strange species, so varied in appearance and behavior. Some were tall and slender, others short and stocky. Their skin tones ranged from pale to dark, and their hair came in a multitude of colors and textures. But what intrigued Zixia the most was their apparent lack of a mating season. Back on Xylaria, the mating season was a time of intense activity. The air would hum with pheromones, and the entire population would become singularly focused on the task of reproduction. It was an orderly process, governed by biology and tradition. There was no room for deviation. Yet here on Earth, Zixia saw no signs of such a season. Humans interacted freely, without the urgency or formality she was accustomed to. They laughed, joked, and touched each other in ways that seemed almost random. How did they manage to propagate their species without a defined season? As she observed the humans around her, Zixia began to notice patterns, though they were far from the structured rituals of her home. A man and a woman might share a lingering glance or a shy smile. Friends of different genders hugged or held hands without any apparent intention to mate. Couples walked side by side, some with children in tow, but there was no clear indication of when or how those children had come to be. It was all very confusing to Zixia, and the more she watched, the more questions she had. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned shades of orange and pink that Zixia found breathtaking, she decided to ask one of her human hosts about their mating customs. Her host, a woman named Sarah, had been kind and patient with Zixia's many inquiries. Zixia felt comfortable enough to broach the subject that had been perplexing her since her arrival. "Sarah," Zixia began, her voice melodic yet tinged with uncertainty, "I have observed that your people do not seem to have a mating season. How is it that your species reproduces? Is there a specific time or ritual that I have yet to witness?" Sarah blinked in surprise, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She had encountered many questions from Zixia, but this one was particularly unique. "Well, Zixia," she said, choosing her words carefully, "humans don't have a mating season like some other species. We can form relationships and have children at any time of the year." Zixia tilted her head, her antennae twitching slightly as she processed this information. "But how do you know when it is the right time to reproduce? Without a season, how do you coordinate?" Sarah chuckled softly, trying to suppress her amusement. "It's more about personal choice and timing, Zixia. People decide when they're ready to have children, and sometimes they don't decide at all, it just happens. We form bonds based on love, companionship, and mutual respect. Reproduction is just one aspect of those relationships." Zixia nodded slowly, though she was still puzzled. "So you choose when to mate based on feelings?" "Yes, feelings play a big role," Sarah confirmed. "But it's also about circumstances, whether a couple feels financially and emotionally prepared, if they both want children, and so on. It's not just biological, it's a lot more complex." Zixia considered this for a moment, her mind racing with thoughts. The idea of choosing to mate based on feelings and circumstances was entirely foreign to her. On Xylaria, mating was a duty, something done for the continuation of the species. There was no room for personal preference or emotional bonds. The concept of love, as Sarah described it, was fascinating and perplexing to Zixia. "I think I understand," Zixia said finally, though she knew she had much more to learn. "Your way is very different from ours, but I see that it works for your species. Perhaps there is more to relationships than just reproduction." Sarah smiled warmly, sensing that Zixia was beginning to grasp the complexities of human relationships. "Exactly, Zixia. Relationships are about connection, trust, and shared experiences. Reproduction is just one part of it." As the evening wore on, Zixia and Sarah continued their conversation, delving into topics of love, family, and the many ways humans form bonds with one another. Zixia found herself both bewildered and enlightened by what she learned. The human way of life was so different from what she had known, yet it had a certain beauty to it, an unpredictability that made every interaction meaningful in its own way. By the time the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Zixia felt she had taken the first step in understanding the human species. There was still much to learn, but she was eager to continue her journey. The cultural exchange program had already proven to be an eye-opening experience, and Zixia knew she would never see the world, or her own species, in the same way again. Zixia's curiosity about human behavior had been growing steadily since her arrival on Earth. The more she observed, the more questions she had. Every interaction she witnessed seemed to defy the norms she had grown up with on Xylaria. There were no obvious signs of a mating season, no biological cues or rituals that indicated when humans were ready to reproduce. This was a mystery she felt compelled to solve. As the days passed, Zixia became increasingly preoccupied with this puzzle. Her human friends seemed so casual about their interactions, freely mingling with one another in ways that were both confusing and fascinating to her. The lack of structure or apparent purpose behind their behaviors made Zixia's curiosity burn even brighter. She noticed that humans often spent time together in pairs or groups, but there was no clear pattern that indicated any kind of mating behavior. How did they know when to mate? How did they choose their partners? The questions buzzed in her mind, and she knew she would have to find answers. One afternoon, while sitting with her closest human friend, Tom, Zixia could no longer contain her curiosity. Tom had been incredibly patient with her questions so far, explaining everything from human cuisine to their strange habit of wearing shoes. Surely, he wouldn't mind answering a few more questions about something as important as reproduction. "Tom," Zixia began hesitantly, her antennae twitching with nervous energy. "I've been wondering about something, and I hope you won't find it too strange." Tom looked up from the book he was reading, giving Zixia a warm smile. "You can ask me anything, Zixia. What's on your mind?" Zixia took a deep breath, trying to frame her question in the least awkward way possible. "I've noticed that humans interact in very unique ways. But I haven't been able to discern when your mating season occurs. Could you explain how your species handles reproduction?" Tom blinked, momentarily taken aback by the directness of the question. He wasn't quite sure how to respond. After a brief pause, he chuckled, though he tried to suppress it. "Well, Zixia, humans don't really have a mating season. We can reproduce at any time of the year." Zixia's eyes widened in surprise. "Any time of the year? But how do you know when it's the right time? Without a season, how do you decide when to mate?" Tom scratched the back of his head, searching for the right words. "It's more complicated than that. Humans don't mate purely for reproduction. It's often tied to emotions, like love or attraction. We form relationships, and those relationships can lead to having children when the time feels right." Zixia tilted her head, trying to make sense of this. "So you choose when to mate based on emotions? How do you know when those emotions are strong enough?" Tom laughed, though not unkindly. "It's different for everyone, Zixia. Some people fall in love quickly, others take time. It's not really something that can be measured or scheduled like a season. It just happens when it feels right. Zixia's confusion deepened. But how do you maintain your population if there's no structure? Doesn't it lead to chaos? Tom smiled, realizing how alien this concept must seem to Zixia. Not really. Humans have been doing it this way for a long time. It works for us, even if it seems chaotic. We don't have a set time or place, we just let things happen naturally. Zixia nodded slowly, processing this new information. It still didn't fully make sense to her, but she appreciated Tom's effort to explain it. However, her next question was one that she felt compelled to ask, even though it was bound to be awkward. Tom, when two humans form a relationship, how do they know who will be the best mate? Is there a test or a ritual? Tom couldn't help but laugh again, though he quickly apologized. Sorry, Zixia, it's just that we don't really have a test or ritual for that. People usually spend time together, get to know each other, and if they feel a strong connection, they might decide to become mates, or what we call a couple. It's more about compatibility and shared feelings. Zixia frowned, more confused than ever. So, there's no clear indicator? How do you avoid making mistakes? Tom shrugged, his expression growing a bit more serious. Sometimes people do make mistakes. Not every relationship works out, and that's okay. It's part of the process. We learn from it and move on. This was a concept Zixia found particularly challenging. On Xylaria, the mating process was so regimented that mistakes were almost unheard of. The idea that humans could form a relationship, realize it wasn't right, and then end it seemed incredibly inefficient to her. It sounds like a very unpredictable system, she said carefully. But I suppose it must work if your species has survived this long. Tom nodded, appreciating her attempt to understand. It's definitely not perfect, but it's how we do things. The unpredictability is part of what makes human relationships so interesting. Zixia pondered this, realizing that human culture was far more complex than she had anticipated. Their lack of a structured mating season, their reliance on emotions, and their acceptance of mistakes all pointed to a very different way of life. Yet, despite the differences, Zixia could see the value in the human approach. It allowed for flexibility, personal growth, and a deeper connection between individuals. As they continued talking, Tom answered more of Zixia's questions, doing his best to explain the nuances of human relationships without overwhelming her. Zixia listened intently, fascinated by the many layers of human behavior that were slowly being revealed to her. There were still many things she didn't understand, but she was beginning to see the beauty in the humans' seemingly chaotic ways. By the end of their conversation, Zixia felt a strange sense of admiration for the humans. Their lives were so different from hers, yet there was something uniquely compelling about their approach to relationships. It was messy, unpredictable, and at times downright confusing, but it was also full of passion, emotion, and individuality. Zixia couldn't help but wonder how her own species might benefit from adopting even a small part of the human way of life. The idea of forming a relationship based on personal choice rather than strict biological dictates was both terrifying and exhilarating. Perhaps there was more to life than simply following the rules laid out by tradition. As the sun set and the conversation came to a natural end, Zixia thanked Tom for his patience and insight. She knew that she still had much to learn, but she was eager to continue her exploration of human culture. The more she discovered, the more she realized that the differences between their species were not obstacles, but opportunities for growth and understanding. After their initial conversations, Tom and the other humans in the cultural exchange program realized that Zixia's understanding of human relationships was still limited by her upbringing on Xylaria. To help her grasp the complexities of human interactions, they decided to organize a series of educational sessions. These weren't formal classes, but rather casual discussions and explanations that aimed to provide Zixia with a more structured understanding of human biology and cultural practices. They started with the basics, using simple scientific explanations to describe human reproduction. Tom, with his gentle and patient demeanor, took the lead. He explained how humans develop from a single cell into complex beings, using diagrams and analogies that Zixia could relate to. The discussions covered everything from genetics to the role of emotions in human relationships. Zixia was fascinated by the details, especially the concept of genetics, which was surprisingly similar to her own species' biology. However, when they delved into the idea that humans didn't have a mating season, Zixia's curiosity turned into disbelief. "You mean to say," Zixia began slowly, her eyes narrowing in thought, "that humans are capable of reproduction at any time? There's no biological trigger, no season to mark the beginning of this process?" Tom nodded, smiling at her growing comprehension. "That's right, Zixia. We don't have a specific season for it. Our bodies are always ready, but the decision to have children is often influenced by emotional, social, and personal factors." Zixia stared at the diagrams in front of her, her mind racing. This concept was so foreign to her that it took a moment for it to fully sink in. On Xylaria, the mating season was a well-defined period, dictated by the planet's cycles and the species' biology. There was no room for personal choice or emotional influence. Yet here on Earth, everything seemed so fluid. "But how do you maintain order?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. "Without a set time, how do you ensure that the population doesn't grow too large or too small?" Tom chuckled, appreciating the simplicity of her question. "It's not as chaotic as it seems. Human societies have developed various methods to manage population growth, including family planning, education, and societal norms. It's more about personal responsibility and making choices that are right for each individual or family." Zixia absorbed this information, her mind struggling to reconcile it with her own experiences. The more she learned, the more she realized how different human life was from her own. Yet, there was an underlying similarity that she couldn't ignore. The desire for connection, for building bonds with others, was universal. It just manifested differently in each species. As the sessions continued, Zixia began to see the similarities and differences more clearly. She compared the human practices with those of her own species, often bringing up points that sparked lively discussions. For instance, she noted that while Xylaria's mating season ensured that the entire population reproduced at the same time, it also limited the ability for individuals to form deeper, more meaningful connections outside of that season. "On Xylaria, relationships are more practical," she explained. "We form bonds based on the needs of the season, and while there is affection, it's not the same as what you describe. Your connections seem to be based more on choice and emotional compatibility." Tom nodded, understanding where she was coming from. "That's true, Zixia. Humans often form relationships that are rooted in emotional bonds rather than just biological needs. We choose our partners based on love, trust, and shared experiences, which can sometimes lead to stronger, more resilient relationships." Zixia found this concept both intriguing and unsettling. The idea that relationships could be based on something as intangible as emotions was difficult for her to fully grasp, yet she couldn't deny the appeal of it. There was something beautiful about the human way, something that allowed for a deeper, more personal connection. She began to wonder if her own species was missing out on something valuable by adhering so strictly to their biological imperatives. As the discussions progressed, Zixia noticed a change in herself. She started to appreciate the human approach, even if she didn't completely understand it. The more she learned, the more she realized that there was no single, right, way to form relationships. Each species had its own methods, its own customs, and while they were different, they all served the same fundamental purpose: connection, continuity, and the survival of the species. In the end, these educational moments did more than just teach Zixia about human biology and culture. They bridged a gap between her and her human friends, fostering a mutual respect and understanding that went beyond words. Zixia began to see the humans not as strange or chaotic, but as a species with their own unique wisdom and strengths. Likewise, the humans came to appreciate Zixia's perspective, recognizing that their differences were not obstacles, but opportunities to learn and grow. By the time the sessions were over, Zixia felt a deep sense of connection with her human companions. She might never fully understand their ways, but she no longer felt the need to. Instead, she embraced the diversity of their experiences, knowing that it enriched her own understanding of the universe. The cultural exchange program had achieved more than just knowledge, it had created bonds that would last a lifetime, and for that, Zixia was deeply grateful. Over the weeks, the bond between Zixia and her human friends deepened in ways she hadn't anticipated. What had started as a simple cultural exchange blossomed into genuine friendship. Zixia found herself increasingly comfortable with the humans, especially Tom, whose patience and kindness had guided her through the maze of human relationships. The more time she spent with them, the more she appreciated their differences, seeing them not as barriers but as bridges to understanding. Zixia noticed that her human friends also began to open up to her in ways they hadn't before. They shared stories of their own lives, their struggles, and their triumphs. Zixia listened intently, fascinated by the complexities of their experiences. In turn, she shared tales from Xylaria, describing the rigid structure of her society and the intense focus on survival and reproduction during the mating season. What surprised her most was how eager the humans were to learn about her world, not just out of curiosity, but out of a genuine desire to connect. One evening, Tom suggested that they exchange cultural practices as a way to deepen their understanding of each other. Zixia hesitated at first, unsure if her people's rituals would be of any interest to the humans. But Tom's enthusiasm was infectious, and she soon found herself sharing the story of the Xylarian bonding ceremony, a ritual that solidified relationships within her species. The ceremony, she explained, involved a series of symbolic gestures that represented trust, loyalty, and mutual respect. Tom, in turn, shared a human tradition, the simple act of cooking and sharing a meal together. Zixia found the idea charming, if a bit mundane, but as they prepared the meal together, she began to understand the significance behind it. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the time spent together, the cooperation, and the joy of creating something as a group. The experience was surprisingly intimate, and Zixia felt a warmth in her chest that she hadn't expected. As they sat down to eat, Zixia realized that these shared experiences were more than just cultural exchanges. They were moments of genuine connection. The differences that had once seemed so vast now felt like pieces of a puzzle, fitting together to create a fuller picture of life. Zixia found herself laughing along with her friends, feeling a sense of belonging that she hadn't felt since leaving Xylaria. For the first time, she saw the value in the human way of forming relationships, how it allowed for a deeper, more personal bond that wasn't constrained by biology or tradition. That night, as Zixia lay awake, she reflected on everything she had learned since coming to Earth. Her views on love and relationships had changed profoundly. On Xylaria, relationships were practical, almost transactional. They served a purpose, but they lacked the emotional depth she had witnessed among the humans. Here, relationships were built on trust, mutual respect, and most importantly, choice. The idea that one could choose their partner based on personal connection rather than necessity was both liberating and daunting. Zixia realized that she had begun to adopt some of these human values herself. She found herself thinking more about the emotional connections she had formed rather than the practical aspects of her relationships. This shift in perspective made her wonder if her own people could benefit from a similar approach. Could Xylaria's rigid customs be softened to allow for more personal choice? Could they learn from the humans just as she had? These thoughts were interrupted by an unexpected challenge. One day, during a routine exchange of ideas, a misunderstanding arose between Zixia and another participant in the program, a Xylarian male who had recently joined the group. He was more traditional, holding firmly to the belief that their ways were superior to those of the humans. When he questioned the value of the bonds Zixia had formed with her human friends, she felt a surge of frustration and hurt. The old Zixia might have deferred to his authority, accepting his criticism as valid. But the new Zixia, shaped by her time with the humans, found herself standing her ground. She explained calmly but firmly that her experiences on Earth had taught her the importance of emotional connections, that there was value in the human way of building relationships. The human approach wasn't inferior, just different, and it had its own strengths that could complement their own. This moment was a turning point for Zixia. It was the first time she had openly challenged the traditional views of her people, and it was also the first time she fully realized how much she had changed. She no longer saw her human friends as simply part of a cultural exchange. They were true friends, people she cared about deeply. And she knew that these relationships had helped her grow in ways she never thought possible. As the misunderstanding was resolved, with the Xylarian male begrudgingly acknowledging her points, Zixia felt a sense of pride. She had applied her newfound understanding in a real situation, and it had strengthened her bonds with both her human and Xylarian friends. It was a moment of clarity, a confirmation that the connections she had made were not only valid but vital to her growth as an individual. The experience solidified Zixia's belief that diversity in thought and practice wasn't something to be feared or resisted, but embraced. It was through these differences that she had found her place on Earth, and it was through these differences that she would continue to grow. As the cultural exchange program continued, Zixia knew that she had not only learned from the humans, but had also taught them something valuable in return. The connections they had forged were stronger than any cultural barrier, and Zixia was ready to carry these lessons with her, wherever her journey might lead. The tension from the earlier conflict had left a lingering unease among the group, but Zixia was determined not to let it fester. She knew that if they didn't address the misunderstanding, it could undermine everything they had worked to build. Gathering her friends, both human and Xylarian, Zixia proposed an open conversation where everyone could express their thoughts without fear of judgment. The discussion started cautiously, with each side tentatively sharing their perspectives. Zixia's Xylarian counterpart expressed his concerns about losing their cultural identity, fearing that adopting human practices might weaken their species' traditions. The humans, in turn, acknowledged the importance of respecting other cultures but emphasized that understanding and adapting didn't mean abandoning one's roots. Zixia listened carefully, her mind racing to find a way to bridge the gap. Drawing on everything she had learned, she spoke with a calm conviction. "We don't have to choose between our cultures," she said, her voice steady. "We can take the best from each and create something stronger. Our traditions are valuable, but so is the knowledge we've gained here. By combining our strengths, we can grow in ways we never imagined." Her words resonated with the group, easing the tension and allowing for a more constructive dialogue. As they talked, it became clear that the conflict had stemmed not from malice, but from fear of the unknown. With this understanding, they were able to move past their differences, finding common ground in their shared desire for growth and connection. In the days that followed, Zixia found herself reflecting on the journey she had undertaken. The experiences on Earth had changed her, but not in the way she had initially feared. Rather than feeling disconnected from her own culture, she felt more connected to it than ever, but with a new perspective that enriched her understanding of both worlds. The time had come for Zixia to return to Xylaria, but she knew her journey was far from over. With a newfound clarity, she made the decision to share her experiences with her people. She wanted them to see what she had seen, to understand that embracing diversity didn't mean losing oneself, but rather finding new ways to grow. She was determined to promote greater cultural exchange, believing that her species could benefit immensely from the knowledge and perspectives she had gained. As Zixia prepared to leave, her human friends gathered to say their goodbyes. The bonds they had formed were strong, and the thought of parting was bittersweet. Tom, who had become like a brother to her, expressed his pride in the growth they had all experienced together. "You've taught us as much as we've taught you, Zixia," he said with a warm smile. "Remember, this isn't goodbye. It's just the beginning of something bigger." Zixia smiled back, her heart full of gratitude. "I'll never forget what I've learned here," she replied. "And I'll make sure my people understand the importance of what we've shared. This is just the start of a new chapter for all of us." As she reflected on the journey, Zixia realized that the most important lesson she had learned was not about biology or culture, but about acceptance. She had come to Earth with a narrow view of relationships, bound by the traditions of her species. But through her experiences, she had learned that there was no single way to live, no universal truth that applied to all. Each species, each individual, had their own path, and the beauty of life lay in the diversity of those paths. The humans had taught her that love and connection were not limited by biology or tradition, but were choices made in the heart. And she had shown them that even the most rigid customs could be adapted, that growth and change were possible if one was willing to listen and learn. Together they had discovered that the differences between them were not barriers, but opportunities to enrich their lives and cultures. As the time to depart arrived, Zixia felt a sense of peace. She was no longer the uncertain Xylarian who had first stepped onto Earth, but someone who had grown through understanding and acceptance. She knew that the lessons learned would stay with her, guiding her as she continued her journey. The farewell was emotional, but filled with hope. Zixia boarded the ship that would take her home, looking back one last time at the planet that had changed her life. The doors closed, and as the ship ascended, she felt a deep connection to the friends she was leaving behind.